Hello and welcome to the Product Shipping Forecast, where we help you navigate the treacherous waters of product development. I'm Rob, a product designer at Zero Heights, and I'm joined by my co-host and product engineering colleague, Rosie.
Your co-heist. Sounds like we're
Co-host.
gonna go rob a bank or something. Hello.
Sometimes it feels that way, just trying to get stuff across the line. For this episode, we are stepping away from discussion on more general design and development practices and talking about something that we do in our squad that I think is fairly specific to how we work, but still think that there's things that people can learn from this approach, and hopefully will help them to make sort of little and impactful updates to their products. And that is kind of a process that we refer to internally as small but mighty. So I guess the first thing to do is to kind of address what is small but mighty.
It is a great name for something. I still don't quite remember how we got to small but mighty, but it is essentially small, little, not really projects, too big of a word, small little improvements that we make to the product within our team. They're generally ones that don't require too much design work. And don't require really much research beforehand, just sort of based off intuition or feedback we've heard from customers before. And we're sort of these small minor improvements that we feel otherwise might be overlooked. They're quite often things that will make people's lives better, but won't necessarily sort of move a metric that means that we can have it as a big focus within our team. It's how I would try and summarize it anyway.
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair. It's also interesting because you mentioned sort of minimal design effort. And I think some of that comes from like where small but mighty kind of originally started, which was, I was quite busy at the time working on kind of like larger project stuff, but the engineers being quite fast at delivering, we were kind of running out of things to do. So it was really an opportunity for us to start to think about ways that we could make those little improvements to the product, like resolve some of kind of like our long-standing issues, or just neat little ideas we'd had to kind of improve the user experience that wouldn't necessarily require like distracting or sort of context switching away from the primary focus. But I think that's kind of changed over time as well, right? Some of our more recent stuff has definitely been a bit more design involved and a bit more kind of UI focused in some cases.
Yeah, I was about to say, I think we've gone from, at first it was really like the tiny projects where it was like, we have a GitHub integration, but we don't have a Bitbucket integration. What would that look like? And that not really needing much design at all, or something we sort of go away and look at. Whereas, some of the more recent stuff has been quite involved in design, sort of around adding like more rich links into our editor, which although I think us as developers had some idea of what it would look like based off other editors that are out there, I think it was one that we needed a lot more of your input on to actually get something that we could put out into the product. So it has definitely, I think it's gone up and down, and there have been some where we've really needed to do another bits where we just have managed to go without you.
Yeah, I think some of that again is just from, being able to trust in the team to sort of know when they can reuse stuff that already exists. So whether that's existing components or like patterns that we have used elsewhere. So like that example of adding more sort of code repo integrations into the product, like we have a flow for how you add like a new repository. You can kind of just reuse that UI, just changing out copy and content. And maybe the design involvement there is just kind of like, does this make sense? Or, hey, we need, we're adding GitLab. Can we get like an icon asset for that so that we can actually like display it in the way a user would expect?
Yeah.
And that's quite nice because it does mean that I, don't have to be super involved, and also means that when there's some nice like UI stuff, it's also quite a nice break from some of the bigger design work as well. Like the rich link preview stuff was quite fun to look at and think about, how that kind of works, not just on desktop, but for mobile viewers as well. And kind of like playing about with just how we, make that kind of look a bit more impactful as well.
Yeah. I think you hit on a key point there with the terms of it being a little break, and I think that's some of where it came from us developers. Sort of, not only was it based on like, oh, you know, we've changed like the squad strategy, and so Rob needs some time to actually like think through things, but I think it was also we had some like big long running projects, and I think as developers it can get slightly, you know, tedious if you're working on one feature for a really long time. And it actually, like, having these like small but mighty projects meant that you could take a little break away from that. So, you know, I think at the time, I think when this started, we were working on the tokens management feature.
Yeah,
Maybe,
possibly.
which like spanned like 9 months, I think, all in all.
Yeah.
And like that, near at the end, it was definitely a little bit sort of like, oof, my brain is sort of overwhelmed just constantly looking at tokens management. And you didn't really feel like you were ever exploring anything new. And so being able to pick up like a small task and work on, you know, themed logos for style guides just suddenly gave you a different area of the code base to look at and looking at solving different problems. And so, yeah, I think it's incredibly like beneficial to the product in terms of covering off small tasks that we wouldn't usually do. I think users tend to like the things we make from it, which is nice. But I also think it is quite good for team morale in terms of keeping people excited, meaning, you know, allowing people to work on new things. I think is super important.
Yeah, I think that's like the interesting thing. I think we maybe jokingly referred to it at first as like small but mighty, not really expecting kind of like much. It's just like these are just like nice little things that we could do. And actually seeing some of the feedback when we have kind of resolved stuff, particularly stuff that has been like long-standing kind of like complaints with the product. They're not like major, no one's not going to use a feature, but are just kind of like, it would be better if it did this. And then being able to say like, oh yeah, like we now support this. It only took us, you know, like a couple of days to kind of go through the entire process of like implementing a thing. And just seeing like, it's just being able to like ship delight is like really quite nice, because I think it's a thing that a lot of teams really struggle to do. And like every company I've worked at has always talked about wanting to be able to ship delight, wanting to add more of that into the product, and it just never gets prioritized at all over big feature work.
Yeah, I was about to say, I think one of the really good examples of that is obviously we implemented the new theme editor last year, and like we did pretty good at that. But it wasn't too long until people were sort of saying, oh, you've now got tokens in zero height and we've got like themes. I would love to be able to use tokens in themes. And at the time, sort of we had to move on from the theme editor. And so we didn't feel like we could necessarily tackle it. And then we had space for small but mighty again. And actually it turned out that we could do a really quick iteration of using tokens in themes within, as you said, I think it was like a day. And we just sort of did it. And yeah, okay, it's potentially one that you could look at and say, maybe it's not the most complete feature because your tokens don't stay in sync. We just use the value that it is at that time. But actually, it was a great way to please users who are setting up their themes for the first time and just want to use their tokens. And it's also a good way for us to get feedback. You know, we're still actively collecting feedback in the theme editor area. And so it's then interesting to see if that's enough for users or if actually it would be something that's, you know, sort of worth going back to. So we can also use small but mighty in that sense to sort of test the waters with first iterations of certain things.
Yeah, we haven't done that as much, but I think definitely that ability to experiment and like put something in there that's very kind of like low cost from a sort of product development standpoint, but would enable us to like get more feedback or even just be able to prove to the business like, hey, this might actually be worth us doing a bit more on.
Yeah.
It's also like theming, I think, is a great example because I think we've had quite a few sort of small but mighty features that have kind of come out off the back of like adding better theming into the product. You mentioned obviously being able to use tokens to find the colors you want to use in theming, but also things like adding like themable logos, themable cover images, all things that I think like we had a couple of ideas originally we wanted to do that as part of the theming work. Obviously with the nature of like having to ship something and get it out there, that kind of got deprioritized. But it was great to be able to then use small but mighty to kind of bring those things back to the fore. We had some pre-existing designs and be able to kind of get those through was like really helpful. And again, just I think showed the power of that process for letting us do a little bit more than just kind of core feature work.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that is a really great example. I guess that sort of leads to the question of how do we manage small but mighty alongside the squad's primary focus, because I think that's a lot of the question that I hear sort of internally in terms of like how do we deal with that, but also I think as people hearing this process for the first time might wonder.
Yeah, and I think it's something that's changed a little bit over the time, because when we first started doing small but mighty, it was very ad hoc, right? It was a, hey, our backlog is looking pretty light. Is there anything we could do so the engineers aren't twiddling their thumbs for a sprint or two?
Yeah.
And that was like really just kind of like going out there and just gathering ideas, looking at our product board, chatting to CS, kind of gathering just ideas and really just kind of, I think Nick, our PM, kind of organized a bit of an async voting where we were kind of like, what are we most interested in? Drop comments and feedback. And that allowed us to kind of, say, hey, this thing would be really cool to, hold on, my audio recording has just stopped. Right. Nick organized an async kind of voting process, which then allowed anyone to kind of pop in kind of questions on and allowed them to just sort of say like, this would be really cool to do, or adding comments saying like, hey, this is a really neat idea, but I think actually like the level of design involved like required is a bit too high, or this would actually require us to kind of like do some gnarly stuff on the back end to get this working, unless you want to do it properly, in which case it's going to take a lot of time. So at first it was very ad hoc. I think after we kind of proved that was valuable, we've sort of moved into a bit more of a like small but mighty is like a sort of ongoing Notion doc we have now that we can kind of like continually add ideas to, and kind of whenever we have kind of like space, start to pull that sort of stuff in. I think the other thing is a lot of small but mighty ideas have kind of spun out of like 10% time investigations as well.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
So yeah, maybe you can speak to that a little bit in terms of like, because I think a lot of these ideas do come from engineering in particular, and how that kind of factors into how you work.
Yeah, I think since we've had this idea of small but mighty, and since it's become sort of a thing that we're constantly doing in the team, I think it has actually sort of put the engineers in a place where they want to come up with ideas more. And so I think it's sort of reignited the idea that we want to spend our 10% time, which is one day every 2 weeks, just to explain what that is, 1 day every 2 weeks, where we can do whatever we want as long as it's improving our skills. But yeah, I think as engineers, like we've enjoyed actually spending that 10% time thinking about ideas that we think could be done in a small amount of time. So things like the rich link preview came out of that. There will also be reactions in comments, which should be out by the time people hear this podcast, which has also come from a 10% time. And I think we now sometimes frame our 10% times in that way of going, can I think of something that I also believe we can do in the squad as part of small but mighty? Which I think means we have more and more ideas coming in. I think the other thing that's super important that has changed over the time is that when we first started doing small but mighty, we weren't necessarily talking about it loads until it was released. Whereas now I think we try to incorporate it back on our sort of like our roadmap that we show to like the customer facing teams, where we go, these are the things we're working on. We now have started to include the small but mighty items on there when they're going to potentially span over a few weeks, because we're only doing sort of like 1 or 2 tickets a week, so that they actually have knowledge that it's happening, so they can talk to customers about it. And also some of them we've tried to get more customer feedback on, based on sort of things that customer support or whatever have heard in the past.
Yeah, that thing about kind of raising the visibility of small but mighty, I think is also quite interesting. Yes, these are very quick things, but also think about how we can make sure that still fits into a process that makes people aware of what's happening. And I think we've managed to kind of balance something quite nice that is relatively lean as well. So, we have like a fortnightly catch up with the kind of customer facing teams where we can kind of share that stuff. We have a roadmap internally that allows us to kind of share that stuff. And also like people are more aware of what small but mighty is now as well. So they've got a better context for what kind of feature to expect at the other side of this process.
Yeah, I think that's the other thing is now that they're more aware, I've also found the communication flows the other way. So some of our small but mighty features have come directly from what customer success people have said to us. So, for example, the search results analytics, where if someone tries to search for something and they don't get any results, they can basically click something that says, I was looking for X page. I was looking for a page about buttons and I couldn't find one. That feature did actually come directly from a conversation with Margot, one of our customer success managers, where she sort of had explained that multiple customers had issues with search, and if we couldn't necessarily go ahead and like improve our search, which is a lot more effort, actually allowing people to log when they're looking for things and they don't find them, sort of fixes it in two directions. It one sort of means that if people are just struggling to find something, maybe a page is just not labeled up well, but also gives the other angle of saying, oh, hey, I'm looking for content around a button and it doesn't look like you have any content. So then those working on the design system documentation can turn around and go, oh, people are looking for a page about this, we should actually work on that. But yeah, it was just really cool that was something that I don't think any of us in the team would have necessarily come up with, because we hadn't, it's not really an angle we'd thought about before. And so it was really cool that we could take an idea directly from customers and actually implement it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that has been quite nice to start to open up a little bit more and kind of gather kind of more input. I guess we've been talking a lot about kind of like the positives and how great this is as a process. But we have got it wrong sometimes. And I'm kind of interested in your thoughts on like where we have got it wrong and like why you think that.
I think there are a good few areas where we've got it wrong. I think I can think of a few different examples where they've gone wrong for different reasons. Let's start with the Zapier setup that we went with. So Seth, one of the developers in our team, had done a 10% time a good while ago on sort of allowing for a Zapier integration with Zero Height. We're like, this seems perfect. We're looking to do more automation. So Zapier is a great first step towards that. And all seemed well and good, because from a tech angle, we'd opened up some nice little API endpoints and hooked up with Zapier, and it seemed great. But then we suddenly realized that actually we kind of needed to work with other departments to get other people to hear about this. So then we were sort of last minute going to marketing and being like, oh, we need your help with lots of this stuff. And obviously they were like, well, we've got other things to do. We can't just do everything for you all of a sudden. And so it kind of meant that we released this feature, but it didn't necessarily get as much sort of visibility as maybe it should have done. And especially with Zapier, because it's not really visible in the product. Like if you're just in Zero Height, you don't necessarily know we have an integration with Zapier. You essentially have to be a Zapier user and search for Zero Height. And so it's actually a really underutilized feature. And I think it comes from the fact that because we didn't go through like a full planning process of like making sure that one, you could find it in the product, and two, that like marketing actually had time to do like a proper campaign around it, it's kind of ended up as something that's just not used, which I think is a shame.
Yeah, and especially because I think Zapier itself was seen a little bit as an experiment. I think that thing of like discoverability was like the big issue. And I don't think it's just on the marketing side. I think we undervalued how much like design was probably needed to better direct people into like Zapier being available, helping them get it set up. Like most of my time was focused just on like, what does the setup flow look like? But it was a feature that we were working on at the same time as, doing quite in-depth kind of discovery and sort of design work on a big upcoming feature. So I wasn't really able to spend too much time kind of thinking about that.
Yep.
And so, yeah, I think we really did kind of like miss the mark a little bit on that. As good as I think that feature is, it's like still well made and works really well. I think it just didn't fully cohere and probably needed to be elevated above the sort of small but mighty, I think.
Yeah. I think that's true. And I think, a lot of that was sort of the design side. So I think another set of small but mighties that we've done that maybe come from a different angle is one that I've kind of mentioned them. And I think there are still positives to them. And I think it's good that we've done them. But we've done all of our integrations, apart from the initial GitHub integration, all of the other like Git repository based integrations have been done via Small But Mighty.
Yeah.
And I think that's been really good because I'm glad we have them all. Like, I think it's better that we can integrate with GitLab and Bitbucket and all of that. I think it's great for the product, but it's meant that they've kind of trickled out at a random pace. We've just kind of gone based off like roughly what we're hearing of, like, we went GitHub and then it's kind of like GitLab should be next. And then we went to Bitbucket and then we sort of jumped back to GitHub self-hosted. And I feel like maybe the way we've sprinkled them in has been a bit random, which is fine. But then I think the main issue is this sort of like maintenance and edge cases with these. So obviously adding in integrations with third parties, there's going to be long-term maintenance. You know, APIs get updated, things change. We're kind of putting a lot back on us without necessarily thinking too far into the future. So the team is technically, at the moment, the way things stand, we're technically responsible for them for the next 2 months. And so we're sort of setting ourselves up that for the 2 months after the integration has been released, we might have to deal with loads more. And then, yeah, there's the edge cases as well, of especially with like self-hosted setups. You know, as people start using them, we've found more and more difficulties.
Yeah, I think anything that has kind of a lot of edge cases or potentially a lot of sort of differences in how people might use them is probably never going to be like a great sort of case for a Small But Mighty. You want something that you can really define the scope of it quite clearly, and you're quite confident isn't going to sort of escalate or snowball into a bunch of other things. I think that maintenance point is also quite interesting because I think a lot of the other features have been like, there's still a little bit of maintenance. You're still going to have like bugs that you might need to fix, or, you know, making sure that kind of like they're still kind of like tested in QA, like that's something we could maybe get into. We still kind of have that as part of the process. But stuff that, like, you know, those integrations are things that people rely on to like operate their sort of, you know, design system documentation, and are therefore like quite critical, quite crucial. Whereas a lot of the other stuff we've kind of shipped is not what you would call like a critical feature.
Yeah, like you take, for example, the rich link previews. I think when we released them, technically you couldn't like comment on them for about 3 days, and it was just something that we'd like completely missed. But that was fine because that wasn't really going to break anybody's workflow. That wasn't going to make it hard for anybody to do something. Like, if they really needed to comment on it, they could just comment above and it wouldn't be too much hassle. Whereas, yeah, as you say, like when we released the GitHub, especially the self-hosted stuff, where, you know, we potentially have to offer out like static IPs so people can let us through firewalls and things like that, there starts to become this whole flow where we even have to get the support team involved, so they know that if they get an email, you know, asking for a static IP, where do they go find that? You know, do we rotate that at a certain time? There's loads of all these extra questions that come out of it. And so, yeah, I'm not saying that the integrations don't fit into it, but they're definitely sort of pushing the boundaries of what Small But Mighty should be. And I think we have kind of acknowledged that because we do somewhat separate them from Small But Mighty. In terms of like, I mean, if you look, not that Jira epics mean anything, but if you look at the Jira epics, they're not under Small But Mighty, they are under their own epics, but we kind of slot them in via the same process that we slot in Small But Mighty, in that they sort of come secondary to our main project goals, basically.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think especially with some of the more recent integrations, right? I think GitLab, for example, was a much bigger project, and so that I don't think was under the Small But Mighty label, but I think something like Bitbucket, I remember, kind of started as Rab doing like 10% and basically having it done.
yeah. Rab basically just did that all in his 10%, and then I think we QA'd it, and I think we tweaked a couple of bits, and then it was just done. But whereas, for example, now we're working on Azure DevOps, this has been the worst integration by far, and this has taken us such a long time, because documentation doesn't make any sense, and because it works so like this is one where we've ended up having to add in like extra screens, which comes back to the whole we're meant to be design light, and luckily, because you know, all of our setup flows are quite rigid, feels like the wrong word, that feels harsh, they're quite well defined, so luckily I feel like I can go ahead and make that screen and just send you a screenshot and be like, what do you think, Rob? And you might tell me to tweak a little bit, but it's probably going to be close enough. But yeah, jumping back to QA, Talk about it, Rob. Tell me about QA of Small but Mighty.
I guess like it's interesting because we talked about how we do QA a couple of episodes ago, and how we try and get everyone on a call. We have a Notion doc. We still have elements of that. I think like the integration work we probably QA closer to what a regular feature would look like.
Yeah.
In fact, I got some login details just the other day from Rab to be like, here's how to test out something else. But I think for some of the other pieces, it tends to be a bit more async. We still have, a Notion page for every feature we work on, whether it's like, a big kind of like multi-month kind of like initiative or, a single sprint, small but mighty kind of ticket. So we're still able to kind of like add stuff, but we're not all jumping on a call at the same time to kind of go through and test it out. It tends to be much more like, hey, can everyone take a look at this today? Make notes of any kind of like bugs and stuff that come up, and kind of move things through that way. I'd say like the big thing with Small but Mighty is like I think we try and operate the sort of end-to-end process in just like a much tighter time frame and just keep it like very lean. So as you say, like we might not skip design. Like I think I worked on designs for the Rich Link previews before we actually built anything, but there's an expectation that like I'm not going to go away for like a week to look at this thing. It's like what could be done in a sort of a day to kind of get something that works. If it needs more time than that, we're probably starting to wonder if it fits within that properly.
Yeah, it's definitely much more async and much more engineering led. And that doesn't mean engineering only, but I'd say in comparison to our other products where I don't necessarily think one particular person leads it. I think it's very much like a full team effort. All three angles are equally in it. Whereas I feel like with Small but Mighty, the aim is that it is more engineering led and there's definitely less lean on sort of like Nick as a product manager and less lean on you, but still some because it's generally still a visual thing and we need it to look okay. But like even with the QA, I think we're happier with engineers having spent more time on it than necessarily like needing to have had you and Nick look at it loads. It's generally good to get like a tick off, but I think the engineers probably QA a little bit deeper on them. I think especially because they're doing the code reviews and QAing it as they go.
Yeah, exactly. Like I think as you said in that previous episode, like the code review is almost a sort of mini QA of any like piece of work that's going through our processes. Yeah, I think also the benefit of things being a bit more engineering led, I think comes down to like we have a better understanding of how this thing's going to be implemented and how it's going to work, which means we can be certain that like this thing will be doable in the time frame that we set for it. Whereas I think this is the problem I've seen in previous companies where we tried to do some form of not quite this, but shipping delight or adding like ways of getting small like incremental improvements to a product in, which is they come from design, they're great, they're really well thought out. Maybe it's something that a designer's done in like 10% time, but there's no sort of understanding of like how complicated that would actually be to achieve in code itself. And a lot of things which can be quite simple to present in design, even if it takes you like quite a while to design it, you go, oh, this was really simple, it's neat, it's like a single page or a single function. But then when you look at like the background data and what is having to happen on the back end, it's like, oh no, that's not going to happen.
So
I think that definitely helps us to kind of keep things at the right kind of scale for what they are.
Absolutely. I do think that's where we've potentially gone wrong in the other direction recently. Not sure if I should name the block on the podcast because it's not going to be out by the time this is out. I mean, I think that's a pretty good summary of Small but Mighty.
I guess, yeah. I wonder if closing thoughts. If someone wanted to start doing this at their company, like what kind of advice would we give? I'm also going to try and offer advice, and I'm putting you on the spot first as I try and think
Nice.
of an
I
answer.
think, yeah, good. Thank you. I think from an engineering point of view, I think if your company offers the opportunity for you to spend like a small amount of time doing things that aren't just sprint work, so like our 10% time, right? I know lots of companies offer similar amounts of time to the developer. Go away and make a proof of concept of something small. I think is the best first start. If you can turn around and be like, hey, look, there's this tiny thing that I think will bring a nice amount of delight to the user. This proof of concept only took me half a day. I think the implementation would only take 3 days or whatever, and pitch it to your team. And I think part of it's about choosing the right time to pitch it to your team. Don't pitch it to your team when you're very busy. But there's always, especially with like fast-paced teams, there's often like dips in activity, either when the quarter's changing and so you're changing strategy, so you're going back to the drawing board, or you've just finished a big project and you've got a little gap. Take those times to sort of pitch a proof of concept and say, let's just give it a try, let's just see. And I think from an engineering perspective, like that's the main thing, is being the one to bring the idea and give an estimate of how long it will take, which hopefully is short. To hopefully get people on board.
Yeah, I was gonna like kind of similar, but for like I think for designers, find an engineer to partner with. Like that's the biggest reason why you're not going to get something through a development process. Is it's great presenting a design and being like, wouldn't it be neat if we did this? But if you don't have that engineer buy-in, like it's probably not going to happen. So yeah, finding a good engineer to partner with who can give you a bit of guidance, who can be realistic about like, is this actually feasible? Definitely going to help. I think also like, I think one of the things that we definitely learned was building off of existing features that we've built was really handy, because we already knew the code base. We knew some of the, the intricacies of why things were the way they were. And even if we didn't pick it up immediately after releasing that feature, I think one we didn't talk about actually is annotation scaling, which has been a pretty long-standing complaint. And so when we released annotations, we sort of automatically just scaled everything down as a flat image. So if you were annotating a button, everything looked fine. If you were annotating like an entire desktop UI, which quite a few people ended up doing, in the documentation, all of the sort of like annotation markers are like super tiny, completely unreadable. And so for a long time, people have been wanting us to handle that. I kind of did look at an approach where it'd be a bit more manual, but that became a jumping off point for, I think it was Seth that worked on this in the end.
Probably.
To basically look at a way to sort of, I guess, programmatically size up the annotation markers. And so that was also, it was a feature we originally worked on. So we knew how that kind of feature worked. We knew what kind of things we were trying to solve. And I think that helped to reduce the amount of time we needed to spend like properly thinking about something, because one, engineer knew the code base and knew how to work with it. And two, we kind of knew what specific challenges we were trying to solve with that, which just made it a much easier sell then into the rest of the team to be like, we should do this. So,
I think you also gave an accidental piece of advice in there as well, which didn't call out so much, which is using user feedback, which I think as an engineer, sometimes I have ideas, sometimes my mind blanks. And like we're quite lucky that we have like product board where we store like things that users have said to us, where they've said, hey, this would be better if it did this, or I wish I could do this. And actually just taking a bit of time to read through some of that can just spark a great idea. And then it's also a way of not having to do user research before you do the feature, because you've essentially done it by just reading feedback and being like, oh, I'm seeing that, as you say, people want annotation scaling. Which we managed to do.
And that was also like, the Zero Slack as well has been really useful for that. We've had quite a lot of kind of instances where we've got feedback that way, and being able to just immediately as a designer or PM or engineer, like dig into like a bit more information on why. I think we've also had a few cases where we've been able to like turn around to someone who's been like, oh, it'd be great if we could do this, with like a week later being like, it exists now.
Yeah, that's always great. I think there was one where someone said something and it was like literally just as I was like merging in the new feature. And I was like, if you refresh your browser in 20 minutes, it'll be there. And that is a great feeling. It's like instant gratification. So
yeah,
I do really enjoy that. Nice. I feel like we've done pretty well there. We've given some advice. Good luck. Hope everyone goes away and tries this. And I'll catch you next time.